There are many types of renewable energy. Hydroelectric energy, electricity generated by water power, is one. Chile, in South America, faced a political crisis when a few homesteaders rebelled against their government's plan to sacrifice a wilderness the size of England in a giant hydroelectric scheme. The homesteaders won, and the result is that Chile is now one of the most advanced users of renewable energy in the world. This chart shows the countries that have expanded their solar electricity generation the fastest over the last 7 years. Chile is the only developing country on the chart. Surprisingly, Chile has recently become the third fastest growing user of solar power. Unlike the other leaders, Chile only began to install solar generation in 2014. A map of Chile will show the source of its recent solar energy boom. Chile is 4,000 kilometers long with a wide variety of climates. In its northern provinces, it has the Atacama Desert, which has the highest intensity of solar radiation in the world. Why did it take so long for Chile to exploit this source of energy? Other sunny countries like Spain and Australia had been significant users years before. Chile's late start in solar energy is what I want to talk about. The reason for it was that for many years Chile's government had been planning a different solution to the energy crisis: hydroelectric power. The hydroelectric power would have come from dams on a river in the almost uninhabited province of Aysén at the other end of Chile. Almost uninhabited, but the few inhabitants of the river valley were homesteaders of a very unusual kind who succeeded in blocking the hydroelectric project. I explored this valley nearly 50 years ago when there was no road access to the region. I saw the homesteaders overcoming extraordinary hardships in their struggle to live with their river under an unyielding military dictatorship. The photographs I took then, and when I went back 30 years later, helped to explain why they defeated the government's plan and saved their way of life. This part of Patagonia is mostly mountains, glaciers and fjords. Cochrane and Tortel are about 100 miles apart, connected by the river Baker Valley. My plan in 1975 was to get to Cochrane and then walk the 100 miles to Caleta Tortel, following the river. There was no information on what I would find there, and Caleta Tortel wasn't marked on the maps. I got to Coyhaique, the provincial capital, and took this picture of the town's dairy nestled in the riverbed surrounded by the poplar trees characteristic of Chilean landscapes. I discovered there was a small dirt airstrip in Coyhaique, and miraculously there was a plane leaving for the south next day with a place for me in it. It was a Douglas DC-3, a World War II workhorse that could land on any relatively flat piece of ground. We landed in several places, usually on dry riverbeds. People rode out to meet us and collect parcels. The man with Brylcreem hair bottom right is the Argentinian pilot, who is allowing fuel to be siphoned out of his wing tank into a local tractor. There's a pair of oxen and one man wearing white sheepskin chaps like cowboys do in the movies. Finally, we arrived at Cochrane, where there was a proper dirt airstrip and the whole town turned out to meet us. There is a truck in the picture, but there was no road to the rest of Chile. It had come from Argentina some time before, but the frontier was now closed because of a border dispute in which a Chilean policeman had been killed. That's the valley of the Baker River in the distance. The whole of Chile was under martial law at the time. There was a state of siege and a nightly curfew, so I wasn't allowed to camp anywhere, but there weren't many soldiers around, so I slipped out of town unchallenged. I found the Baker River easily enough. I camped in this place on my second night at the junction of the Baker and La Colonia rivers. The La Colonia Valley is straight ahead and carries the meltwater from the northern ice field. Every couple of days I passed a homestead. This is one of the more prosperous. The first one I saw was much smaller. I was walking by it, but a cross old woman came out behind me and called, "Is that what you do then, just walk past without saying anything?" I went in and found that she was spinning wool while her daughter was knitting it. They gave me boiling hot matte, which we shared through a brass tube with a strainer at the bottom. It burns your lip until you get used to it. I wish I'd photographed them, but I wasn't yet sure if it would be polite. Testing the water, I asked her to cook me a steak. This was probably offensive because it implied that they might not feed me at dinner time. I didn't yet know the rules. She cooked me a steak with fried dough balls. I asked her how much I owed her, and she replied, "Whatever the heart commands." It sounds beautiful in Spanish, lo que manda el corazón. I gave her $1 in hyperinflating Chilean currency, and she stuffed my haversack with bread rolls. This was one of only 2 occasions in a month when my offer of payment was accepted. But going back to this photograph of Santos Vargas' home, I posted all these photos to a person I had met, but they never arrived, so it was 30 years before the homesteaders saw them. When I went back in 2006, they caused a sensation. I was in a local shop, and a young woman running it said she had heard I had some photos. Could she see them? I showed her, and when she saw this one, she said it was her grandfather's house that had burned down long ago. But she asked me who the little girl was. She didn't remember any children there. Of course it was her. She'd never seen a picture of herself as a child. Supplies weren't going to be a problem. There were no insects at that time in the valley because there was very little commerce with the outside world, and the summer season was too short for them to establish themselves. All I could find for bait was the grasshopper, but this fish loved it. Within seconds it had taken it, and I had it on the bank. The rod had a spinning reel, as you see, but at the last minute in Kawaiaki, I realized that the water might not be clear, and I found a shop selling fishhooks. They asked me how many, but I was in a hurry, so I took the whole bag with dozens in it. I found the homesteaders had no hooks, so I handed them out. Nowadays, billionaires and oligarchs go there for the best fishing in the world. Felipe Vargas rowed me 200 yards across the most powerful river in Chile, risking both our lives. I stayed at the very prosperous homestead of Zacharias Cruces, who laughed when I told him that people up north had said there would be buses in the valley. Next morning, Don Zacharias announced through the bow, "The bus is about to leave, senor." Outside was his 10-year-old son, Attilio, with 2 horses saddled in the local style. I had learned to fish, now I had to learn to ride. A man on foot was regarded as not quite human, even though close related. It was easy to start a gallop to keep up with my guide by just nudging the horse. The only thing was, I didn't know how to stop a gallop. When the beast finally came to rest in the forest, my instructor caught up and said, "Hold the reins short while galloping." I'd never sat on a horse in my life. Attilio took me to the house of Don Zacharias' brother Victor, who was less prosperous and had 13 children. Here are 2 of them. The one on the right was Milton, who was 9 years old. Gail was 7. Neither had shoes and their clothes were homespun. I took them and their older brother Pepe fishing in their father's rowboat. This was foolhardy of me. A very fast-flowing river, homemade rowing boat, no buoyancy aids, 3 rowdy children. But we got a big fish and they loved it. Here's Milton again on the right, holding my fishing rod. His 11-year-old brother Pepe on the left has shoes, but they're only scraps of leather wrapped round his feet and tied with rawhide. They preferred to ride like this, galloping bareback standing up. It made it easier to see where they were going. I'm sorry to say that when I went back after 30 years, I found out that Pepe had drowned soon after. A rowboat capsized in the rapids. They never found his body. It was a common occurrence. The oldest son agreed to row me down to Caleta Tortel. Everyone called him Chileno, which means Chilean. Why would a Chilean in Chile have the nickname Chilean? The clue to this mystery may have been his smart red jacket, obviously store-bought. He bought it with his wages, he said, after the Navy press-ganged him and sent him up north. He didn't know why. He must have been drafted when Pinochet had seized power. His service in the armed forces might be why he was more Chilean than the rest. Most of his community seemed Argentinian in their dialect, their mate drinking, their accoutrements. Were they a group of wandering gauchos who colonized the wilderness before the frontier was defined? This is our homemade rowing boat at the homestead of Don Zenobio, who made guitars. With what materials, I wondered? This is Caleta Tortel, the most remote Chilean naval base, inhabited by a couple and a family of 4 who tended the store, a sergeant and a medical corporal. This is Sergeant Riquelme, the local enforcer of martial law, ruling by decree and feared by everyone on the river. He had confiscated all the homesteaders' firearms and their few outboard motors. My explanation to him that I was there looking for the remains of a ship that was wrecked in 1740 didn't sound plausible even to me. He may have thought I was a high-ranking communist come to rendezvous with the Soviet submarine. The mountains were still full of Marxist rebels trying to get out of the country and being hunted down by Pinochet. The sergeant put me under house arrest in the infirmary with the corporal as my guard until he could contact his superiors by radio and find out what to do with me. This is Carlos Hernandez, who ran the trading post, with his family. Remember this little girl, Maria. We'll meet her again. After a week, the sergeant told me I was of no interest to the High Command. He ordered a party of 3 who were rowing upriver to take me with them. There were 2 young men who did the rowing and an older man, Juvenal Quirinal. Juvenal and I towed the boat where we could, and all 4 of us were often up to our waists in water manhandling the boat through the rapids. We stayed near the bank because the current was slowest, but where fallen trees got in the way, the young men had to chop their way through. That rope you can see is Juvenal pulling the boat through the gap. I should have been helping him, and his young men were not happy that I was taking photos instead of pulling my weight. We arrived back at Chileno's home. Juvenal, on the left, had hidden this amazing sky blue jumper in his kit bag because it turned out that we were going to a wedding. We had reached Chileno's homestead, and the other man is Victor Cruces, Chileno's father. This is the homestead of Zacharias Cruces, the good-natured uncle of Chileno who had lent me a horse and his son Attilio on the way down. His daughter was getting married, and this caused a problem. The young men said I was not allowed to go to the wedding, presumably because I was a friend of the sergeant who had prohibited alcohol and social gatherings in this valley. In vain I told them that I'd been made welcome by Zacharias and his family on the way down. They insisted on leaving me on the island on the left. Juvenal then announced that he would not go to the wedding if I was not going. So the 2 young men rowed away, marooning Juvenal and me, very embarrassed, on the island. But it was precious to have time alone by the campfire with Juvenal. He was much more talkative than his young companions. His whole universe was the river. For money to buy his few supplies, he would cut down trees to make a raft and float it down the river with a few head of cattle on board. He sold the posts at Tortel for shipment further south where there was no timber, and sold the calves to homesteaders. His observations on life outside the valley, as he understood it, gave me a valuable new perspective. Early next morning, the 2 young men rowed back and said that we were to come to the wedding after all. The party was in its 4th day. Don Zacharias made a public speech in which he accused Juvenal of me of disrespect to his family by not coming to the wedding the day before. Juvenal and I stared at the ground and tried not to look at the 2 young men for whom the reprimand was intended. Chileno is in the blue hat on the left. The bride, Zacharias' daughter, is wearing the white cardigan. The groom on her right, the bride's mother Florentina on his right. The patriarch Don Zacharias, in another amazing wedding jumper, is on the right. There were several musicians. The one with the guitar is Attilio, who taught me how to gallop. The sheep roasted on the spit is the traditional asado. Look at the young man in the red and white jumper, the bride's brother. His nickname was Gringo because of his unusually light hair colour. That's why I did not have my usual nickname of Gringo. Instead, they called me Caballero, which means something like gentleman on horseback. Maybe a bit of mild sarcasm. And here I am, obviously not even aware how to sit on a horse properly. Despite the gaucho accoutrements, spurs, wooden stirrups, bolas, big knife, all the gear and no idea, as they say. Gringo and Chileno dancing with the ladies. It consisted of a lot of stamping and hanky waving. I danced with the bride and her mother Florentina on extreme left in her mauve cardigan. This is Chileno, his sister, and Gringo. Gringo was fond of showing off his horsemanship, rearing his horse up on its hind legs like the Lone Ranger. His high point was when he rode his horse up onto the veranda and right into the one-room cabin among the wedding guests. Chileno was going to Cochrane and had offered to take me on horseback, giving Juvenal and his crew a break. They would have to meet us further upriver, where they would have to ferry us across. Chileno is now very proud of my picture of him leading our mule on the path to Cochrane 50 years ago before the road was built. A real pioneer tableau. This is where we met Juvenal for the crossing. I had given Juvenal a fish hook, and he'd caught 3 fish with it, but the 4th had carried it away, so I gave him a few more. On board are Chileno's mother and sister, with Juvenal pulling 3 unwilling horses and a foal into the torrent, ready to cast them free if they panicked and endangered the boat. On the second trip, it was my turn. I must have been standing up on a thwart to take this picture. We bought a sheep for a couple of dollars and invited a family to share it. Chileno doing the mate thing on the left, his mama on the right. On the way downriver, I had met the 3 very pretty sisters in this picture. Their mother had fed me in the cabin you can see up on the hillside, and the 3 sisters sat opposite and stared at me as I ate, an unsettling experience. So that's the end of my photos from 50 years ago, showing you how the homesteaders lived in those days. Now I'll show you some from when I went back 31 years later in 2006. I found the provincial capital, Coyhaique, as it is now, on the right. On the left, my photo from 1975, showing the town's dairy with a few stands of poplars. Now there is commercial forestry everywhere, conifers, not native species. This is looking down on Cochrane from the airstrip. No regular flights anymore because there's a dirt road from Coyhaique, a 9-hour bus ride. The old twin-engine Dakota must be in a museum somewhere. There's a local country singer, Atilio Cruces. He gave me a copy of his CD entitled Drinking Mate by the Fireside. He's the same Atilio Cruces, son of Don Zacharias. He's the little boy who took me on horseback to his uncle's place to meet his cousin Chileno and had to teach me how to ride. Here he is holding the picture of me and him on horseback. It was a good time to turn up in Cochrane with the first colour photos ever taken in the valley, because they were holding their annual traditional meeting and rural exhibition, as it says on the banner. They wanted to teach the young people what life was like in the old days. Photos in colour from 30 years before were just what they needed. They had all the spectacles you would expect, like bronco busting. The roast, the asado, was on a larger scale, a whole cow. I found Chileno. Here's me and him sharing the mate. Here's Chileno showing off the photos to admiring workers in the town hall, who scanned them all into their computer. The ubiquitous mate brew is on the desk. People examining the photos of their departed relatives. One woman kissed the image of her father, never having seen one before. Chileno took me to see his old homestead. It was deserted now, expropriated by the military government and sold to speculators for $2.40 an acre. Remember that little girl, Maria? On the left, as she was in 1975. On the right, 30 years later, with her 2 sons. She was now a widow. I think they only had one fuzzy photograph of their late father, a distant shot coloured by hand. I could help there because I had this picture of him. He was none other than Zacharias' son, whom I only knew as Gringo. I was able to tell them how he rode his horse into a cabin full of guests at his sister's wedding. He'd died of hantavirus. Maria again. Happy little girl, happy lady. But there was trouble brewing. There were anti-government speeches. They were protesting against the plan to dam the Baker River for a hydroelectric scheme. They weren't protesting in the name of ecology or biodiversity, but for more spiritual reasons. The sign reads, Grouping of the Defenders of the Spirit of Patagonia. That expressed exactly what I'd been looking for and found 30 years before. Now there were helicopters clattering overhead, spying out the land and taking rock samples. The local paper ran a story. A helicopter had landed at one of the homesteads, and when the crew accepted an invitation to share a brew of mate, they wiped the mouthpiece. They were aliens. The dam would turn about 1/3 of the river into a lake 40 kilometres long. It had to be that long to take in the broader reaches where most of the water would be held, the rest of the river being in narrow canyons. One of the storage points was the valley of La Colonia, where I had taken the picture, which is inset, in 1975. I photoshopped an impression of before and after the dam, which depressed me. One prominent opponent of the scheme was an American billionaire ecologist, Douglas Tompkins, who had founded the outdoor clothing brand The North Face. He had bought huge tracts of land in the area. I went to a meeting with him where we made speeches calling for less destructive kinds of energy generation, of which Chile had plenty, e.g. solar, geothermal and wind. Tompkins died in the river too. His canoe capsized and he was too far gone with hypothermia by the time they got him to hospital. One of the most unpleasant features of the hydroelectric project was the transmission line. This poster shows pylons and repeats the slogan of the protesters, Patagonia without dams. The project was designed to provide the electric power needs of the copper mining and smelting industry, which was 3,000 kilometres away at the other end of the country. I've marked La Escondida, the biggest copper mine in the world. So they needed a transmission line 2,000 kilometres long to connect to the main national grid at Santiago, the capital. 600 kilometres of this line would run through virgin forest, which would entail clearing and pruning the forest over a large area. This is the mountainous terrain through which the transmission line would pass before reaching relatively flat ground. The cost of this 600-kilometre section would be monumental. It could only be justified by future plans to dam all the other rivers it crosses and take their hydropower up north too. If that wasn't the plan, it would probably be cheaper to use a submarine power cable and avoid contaminating an area of wilderness the size of England. When I came back to Britain, I altered my website, which had been a simple photo essay about the river people of Patagonia, to make it an anti-dam campaign with a melodramatic title. I lectured at the London School of Economics about the threat, but the homesteaders didn't need my help. The following year, the homesteaders organised a protest cavalcade to ride to the provincial capital, Coyhaique. They rode for 9 days, 300 kilometres over the mountains from Cochrane. You can see banners from Rio Baker, Colonia Valley, Rio Salto, etc. They went to court and held up the project on environmental grounds for 7 years. That was long enough to run down the clock on the deadline set by the government for using the free water rights. The copper miners got fed up with waiting and started to buy 100-megawatt solar farms, installing them in a desert next to the mines, off-grid, so they didn't need a transmission line. All that was done without subsidy. The owners of La Escondida, the biggest copper mine in the world, decided they would smelt their 1 million tonnes of copper a year using only wind and solar power. The Baker hydroelectric scheme was abandoned. It hasn't stopped there. Chile soon became the biggest buyer of solar power in the world. Now they're building a 671 megawatt solar farm. That's more than twice as powerful as the Baker Dam and as powerful as the average nuclear reactor. All without government subsidy. And all thanks to the river people of Patagonia. If they hadn't stopped the hydroelectric scheme, Chile would now be an object of pity, not admiration. Atilio, my riding instructor and guide, wrote and recorded a song about the Rio Baker, Little Paper Boat. Someone in Tortel has put a very amateurish music video on YouTube featuring some of my old photographs superimposed on a paper boat.
Botecito de papel, llévame hasta Tortel. Botecito de mi amor, fue el transporte de tu creación.